So, Dr. Moore,
Hello.
you know,
Hello.
yes, how are you?
I'm good. I feel like this is such a, what do we say in the church? We say a Kairos moment, because I have been tossing and turning the last couple of days with the news cycle.
Yes.
And so it feels like the perfect time to be talking about remembrance and ancestors and where we are now. So I'm really appreciative of this moment to be able to have this kind of discussion.
So, can you just introduce yourself and a little bit about your background and what you're doing now?
Yes, so my name is Dr. Porchia Moore. I am an assistant professor of museum studies at the University of Florida in the College of the Arts. I am a curator and a culturist. I regard myself as an information scientist and a cultural heritage informaticist, which essentially means that I am concerned with the intersections of technology and community and engagement. I'm a critical race theorist, and I interrogate and examine the role and function of race within our GLAM sector. And so GLAM stands for Galleries, Libraries, Archives, and Museums. I co-create a project called the Visitors of Color Project with my co-creator, Nikhil Trivedi. And I am an avid museum goer. I'm a passionate person about the outdoors and nature and how we can collectively find our liberation and humanity within cultural heritage spaces.
And you are originally from where?
I am originally from Columbia, South Carolina. I earned my undergraduate from the College of Charleston. My master's degree was dually enrolled in a program between the College of Charleston and the Citadel. I have those degrees in English literature, and I minored in African American studies. And I have my doctorate in library information science from the University of South Carolina and a graduate certificate in museum management.
You are the ancestors' dream, the living embodiment of it.
Yes, absolutely. So before, this is an extension or of the Remembrance program. I'm calling it an extension. It is the Remembrance this year. It's virtual Sankofa, a virtual Remembrance this year because of COVID. And you have come out to Remembrance many times, and
Yes.
I was always really happy to see you when you were able to make it out there.
Mm-hmm.
And that program honors our ancestors who perished during the Middle Passage. We've extended it this year to just have conversations about how we honor the ancestors, how they work through us in our daily lives,
Mm-hmm.
and et cetera. So can you just, from your point of view, define ancestors?
Ancestors are, for me, ancestors equate to the energy that I carry with me, that sense of protection and healing and guidance and wisdom that I find, like I said, in so many of the cultural resources. But for me, ancestors is that collective body of ancestors, of people who perished in that Middle Passage, who fought for our liberation today. And when I think of ancestors, it might sound a little strange, but when I think of ancestors, one of the first things I think about is, first of all, the wisdom from my mother and the wisdom from my grandmother. But then also I think about my children, because I believe that when I look into my children's faces, I'm seeing my ancestors. So yeah, the ancestors are those that guide us, that give us wisdom, that give us our ways of knowing, that empower us to make good decisions, that can inform the ways in which we can thrive and live beautifully and creatively and powerfully within this moment in real time. So that's how I think of ancestors.
And how do you feel about the importance of honoring ancestors?
It is so critical to honor ancestors because their life cannot be in vain. It is so important. Like I said, as a critical race theorist, one of our sort of tenets is to talk about and think about this notion of ways of knowing, how we understand and frame the knowledge that we have. It's important for us to honor and understand our legacies of knowing the ways in which we do things and take pride in those things. Making sure that we create our own yardstick, our own measure of understanding and worth, that we're not measuring ourselves against white normative standards or the standards of anyone else. It's important for us to honor our own ancestors because that knowledge kept them alive. And it's the knowledge that kept them alive that was shared and passed on that we can pull from today to be happy, to be creative, to be joyful, again, to make wise decisions. So it's important for us to honor our ancestors, whether we know their names or not. They are here with us in that collective, shared, information that has been passed down to us from generation to generation. So it's important to honor the ancestors, not just like with a life well lived, but a life that is well shaped and well loved. That's really important.
What are some of the things that you do daily to honor your ancestors, and how do you feel that they are working through you?
I have to share. This is probably the second time I've shared this. I started sharing this with one of my dear beloved sister friends maybe about a month or so ago. But I have been privately for the last about 2 years learning and studying about Oshun and Oya and learning those songs, trying to listen and to hear. And that has been a personal journey for me because I grew up, as a Black woman born and raised in the South. I grew up in the church. And the way that I was educated is that we were sort of disconnected from anything that even gave us the language and the rhetoric to talk about or acknowledge ancestors in a way that did not feel as if we were somehow dishonoring God or Jesus or all, that sort of realm of deity. And so in my own personal life, what I do daily is I am teaching myself the songs of Oshun, the songs of Oya, trying to understand, again, all, and to not just understand, but to like marinate myself joyfully in all of that healing and nourishment and energy that gives me power and strength. And to do so in a way that is a type of unlearning so that I do not feel as if whatever allegiance to Christianity or whatever I have learned as someone who was raised in the church, that it is not a disservice or a dishonor to what I understand and know as God to connect with that source, because that is a source. And so one of the daily practices that I do is I pray. I now have an altar. On that altar, I have candles. I have little cards that I, write prayers. I have shells that I have collected. All of these, I have pictures of ancestors. Ancestors that people like my mother and grandmother, but also people that I don't necessarily know, but that I honor their legacy and their heritage and their wisdom. So those are just some of the things that I do. Then the other thing, as a mother, I have twins, I have a Ibeji. And so what I do also is talk to them about how, again, for me, decision making is about them using their own sort of internal wisdom to like guide them in creating and crafting and shaping their lives and, you know, joy and liberation and all of that, but then also making sure that they understand that they are literally here because somebody was strong and powerful enough to survive, that whatever wisdom that they had was passed on, and that they are the end result of that. And so it's important for them to connect with that, so that they're living in this present moment, but that this present moment was literally a gift to them from some ancestor that we likely, you know, whose name and face we will never know. And that's why I say, you know, when I think of ancestors, I immediately think of my own children, because I look at their faces and I have to understand and recognize that someone way back removed is showing up in their face, is showing up in even my face. And so that, you know, that notion of like self-care and taking care of myself, by taking care of myself and understanding how to take care of myself, that also takes care of and honors those ancestors. Yeah.
Dr. Moore, I recall that you're a poet. I want you to talk about some of the work that you're doing as a curator and some of the projects that you're working on. So I want you to get into that. But I do recall that you're a poet. Is that correct? Am I correct in that? Am I correct? Recollection?
Yes, I am a poet. But I will say that the space that I am in now, that work, that writing, I'm a writer, I'll just say that.
Okay.
And so what I understand in this moment is that a younger self committed to poetry as a way to understand and interrogate my life, to make meaning out of my life. It was a writing practice, but it's also more of a personal practice of mapping out my life. The space where I am now is I'm more of an essayist. I'm more of a creative nonfiction writer. And in my mind, all of those things are connected. So the poet in me, I've been writing poetry since I've been about 4 years old. I will never not be a poet, but will always and forever be a writer. And so that writing, you can find my work at incluseum.com. That is INCLUSEUM.com. It is a collective of researchers and scholars who are interrogating the notion and framework of inclusion within the field of museums and cultural heritage at large. You will find my writing in peer-reviewed journals. You can Google me and you can find me talking literally all over the world about cultural heritage and museums and why race matters, why inclusion matters, why equity matters, why access matters. So the work that I'm doing now, I'm head of department of a museum studies program where I am teaching and cultivating what I believe and what I hope my intention and my goal is to create racially literate, culturally competent museum professionals and cultural heritage professionals who go out into the world understanding that issues of equity, access, and inclusion are not like side things that you have to consider. It is the thing that you have to consider when you work within the cultural heritage sector. You have to ask yourself, whose narratives are not being included and why? What are the historical legacies of exclusion, and how do we then basically make a kind of reparations for them? When we talk about quote unquote diversity, the first question that we have to ask is who is benefiting from diversity? So like I said, the work that I do now, I contribute to this collaborative called the Incluseum. I publish scholarly articles in peer-reviewed journals. I create a project called the Visitors of Color Project, which is a counter-narrative project that literally asks visitors of color to share stories about their experiences within museums. And we felt that that project was important because one of the things that happens in the field is that museum professionals talk a lot about visitors, but we very rarely find powerful, unique, innovative, co-created ways to talk and partner with visitors of color. So we wanted to center those voices as a kind of counter narrative to the ways in which we think about visitors. And the other sort of work that I do is I had the good pleasure to be one of the original architects of a national program called Museums and Race. A lot of some of that work that I put into Museums and Race was the work that informed my dissertation, introducing critical race theory to the field in a way that people were not necessarily talking about race, they were still talking about diversity. The other project that I'm really proud to be a part of, I've been working with the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, an initiative called Mass Action, which stands for Museums as Site for Social Action. And what Mass Action believes is that it is our responsibility to, again, cultivate, inform, and educate a current body of museum professionals who not only believe in equity, access, and inclusion, but systematically dismantle structures of oppression and internal racism so that we can actually cultivate real change within our communities. So I've been really fortunate, again, to be a part of lots of different movements and to help, to be the architect for lots of different movements in the field. I view that work as activist scholarship. It is work that is very important to me. The other thing that I'm helping to do right now is we're helping to raise money for another organization that I'm a part of, a collective that I'm a part of called Museum Workers Speak. And what we have seen is that museums have absolutely, like other industries, has absolutely been gutted by COVID-19. So we're seeing like unprecedented layoffs and furloughs. We're also seeing a lot of inequality. So we're seeing, museum directors who earn $300K keep their salary, if not have their salary, be reduced maybe by 10%, while entire museum staff is laid off. So a woman by the name of Paula Santos and Alyssa Greenberg and some others, that are part of this collective, came together and said, this is not acceptable. And what they did was created a museum workers mutual aid fund. I think as of literally last night or so, we're at or have exceeded $30,000 raised, I think, in less than 3 weeks for museum workers, including, and I think this is the most important thing, specifically and including custodial staff and frontline staff who are literally largely those of color, particularly Black folks. And those were some of the first positions to be eliminated. So I think that is important because oftentimes when we think about museum professionals or those who work in museums, we don't necessarily think about custodial staff. That's some of the work that I'm doing now. That's the work that I'm most proud of. And so, yeah, I view myself and I function as an activist scholar because I believe that whatever I do within the realm of the academy, of academia, also must have a parallel within community. So I believe in embedded scholarship. So I want to make sure that everything that I do is accessible to community, and at the same time going beyond being accessible to community and having that information and that scholarship be something that is available to others in order to empower them, in order to help them, again, make best decisions, to increase creativity and innovation and joy in their lives.
In what ways how do you recruit, or how do you influence, how do you bring in, how do you encourage young people, Black people, people of color to get into this field? And what brought you into it?
Well, what brought me into it was, again, very personal. My mother, again, born and raised in South Carolina. All of my roots are very agrarian. Both sides of my family were cotton farmers and then tobacco farmers. Both of my parents were the first to go to college. My mother was a fourth grade teacher, and she was sort of largely in charge of organizing school field trips. And she was also very into culture and museums and historic sites. So when other kids were like playing outside on the weekends, we were piling into the car and traveling all over the South to visit historic sites and to visit museums. So it was something that was cultivated in me at a very young age. It was something that I was always drawn to. While other kids were watching TV, I was reading the encyclopedia and playing around with my mother's classroom globe. So culture has always been the core of who I am. And so I kind of got into this work because I realized in graduate school, like, hey, this isn't actually a profession. This is actually a career that is attainable. I think that for far too long, we have told our Black children, well, you should be a doctor, you should be a lawyer, or you should just, particularly with our boys, we tell them you should aim high and think about sports. And I think that a lot of that work has now changed. So we're definitely opening up the field of the realm of possibility. But I think that oftentimes we don't think about museum work, or we don't think about librarianship or the role and work of an archivist, and why that is so important for us as people of color. Because you're talking about the fact that all of these, predominantly white run institutions are the arbiters and gatekeepers and architects of our cultural heritage objects and our cultural heritage material. And so that provides opportunity for narratives to either be suppressed, misconstrued, wholly ignored. And so I think it's up to us to think about the ways in which we can kind of take back that narrative, but not even just take it back, but also think about reimagining it. So I got into this work because I was in graduate school at the College of Charleston and had the fortunate opportunity to be able to work at the Avery Research Center, and saw people like you, Miss Wright, and people like Sherman Pyatt, phenomenal archivists, Dr. Chandler, all of these historians and researchers and librarians, curators who were doing all of this fantastic work. And it actually finally clicked for me that this is an actual career. So in terms of like recruitment, I try my best to contribute to that body of work and that activism that helps people understand, first of all, the role and function of a museum, the role and function of a library or an archive, and how phenomenal those spaces are. I think, though, that one of the things I'm always careful about is when we talk about recruitment, we have to always talk about retention. So unfortunately, this field is not a field that pays exceedingly well. So I think that sometimes it's a little bit of a deterrent, because notoriously the museum world, unless you are already at the level of director, is not necessarily the place where comparatively you're going to make, quote unquote, the big bucks. But again, if you are passionate about this work is rewarding. There are lots of changes now about salary reform. There's an entire movement that, again, museum workers speak, and lots of other groups have done a phenomenal job of saying, like, we can no longer offer unpaid internships. So what we're seeing in our field is there's, at this point, I think almost, I don't want to say almost no one, but it's getting to the point where it's almost rare now to offer someone an unpaid internship. And I think that I'm really proud of the work that has been done in that area where we're changing the field, because when you have unpaid internships, you're creating already a level of inequity. So it's, historically feels like GLAM, libraries, archives, and museums, have been those professions which have largely been what we call pink collar, so largely women, but then also largely white women. And so it's really important for us to think about the ways in which we can cultivate the new wave of Black archivists, Black librarians, Black museum scholars and professionals who I think just have a fresh, innovative approach and take on what is culture and what is art and what is history, and infusing those things with with digital technologies in such a way that it single-handedly reshapes the field. And there's so many scholars and young folks doing that now. So it's amazing to kind of see the shifts and changes in the field.
Right, I kind of agree with that. That's going to be interesting even moving forward to see, the ways that people navigate this field.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to hear a little bit about that, but I want you to talk to us, to our viewers, a little bit about material culture, artifacts. What are they? What do people have in their homes that they need to look at a little differently? And how can they preserve some of these items that they might have, that you let us know are important and they should be looking at, in different ways?
I mean, I will say that I owe what I know in this moment originally to people like you, again, Mr. Pyatt, every single phenomenal person.
Curtis Franks.
Yes, Curtis at the Alida, everyone who worked at the Avery Research Center. You all perfectly defined and articulated for me my early understanding of material culture and why it was important to start to, first of all, you all modeled for me. Let me just also say this. You all modeled for me what a community museum actually is and how it functions. So community, the big buzzword in our field is about community engagement, community engagement. I mean, you can see that it's written ad nauseum like a million times. But what is clear for me in the work that Avery has always done is Avery has always had relationship with community. Avery has always been in relationship and has always been in co-creation with community. And so for me, seeing people like Mr. Franks, you, all of these other folks have this rich relationship with folks, and watching people bring in like boxes saying, here are the notes and the minutes from meetings that took place 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Here's this material culture, and this is why it's important. And so being able to frame for community why the material that we have actually matters, and why it's important that we understand what is a document, what is history, why is it like that your neighbor, Mr. Johnson, who, you kind of heard from like the neighbor down the street that he used to be a dentist, but why it's important to kind of go back and unpack some of that. He used to be the first Black dentist in, the first fully sustainable Black neighborhood, all of these sort of different things. So I guess the point that I want to make is that why don't we feel like our quote unquote stuff has value? And how can we get people to understand that everything that we have, every document, every photograph, it is important to, I think about someone like Miss Brenda, who's always documenting, she's always taking pictures, she's always videoing. She is someone who understands the power of material culture, the power of documenting, the power of like historical mapping and blueprinting. And for far too long, I think we have allowed white gatekeepers in these institutions to define for us or to tell us what we have, define it for us, tell us why it's important or why it's not important, or fully exclude it or ignore it because they don't understand what it is. And so for me, that's some of the ways in which we can kind of connect those dots and why it's important for us to understand who we are, to document, to clearly name and identify and label people and individuals, movements, to keep our own records. So not to be gatekeepers, but to keep our own records. The more that we keep our own records, that we write things down, that we clearly label things, that we archive things, the more that we have control over our own historical narrative. And so we don't have to rely upon some institution to rifle through our things and try to reinterpret for us who we are. So that for me is why that's important.
Brenda?
Woo! I always like hearing Dr. Portia. Pardon no traffic going by. No, because she puts these things in ways that they make you just want to touch your soul all over. I looked at the issue of this pandemic and those who were, as many Southern homes or many other homes are, they have access to their elders. And I've said, please give your elders some camera time,
Mm-hmm.
because that Mr. Johnson is somebody's grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have his full story. We have, unfortunately, what we're going to have in hopefully a long time will just be his obituary.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll say, well, he was the first so-and-so.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have the bear witness statement. See, I done learned from y'all. I hang out with y'all enough. I get the right terms. And we don't have those bear witness statements. And right now I'm looking at, that's why I like the bridges that you always make with young people, because somehow they're not fully valuing the resources that they actually have right there in front of them across the dining table. And the fact that even though, yes, they've got relaxed with COVID and families are moving around and meeting the whole nine, they're still not asking questions of their elders or having an exchange. There seems to be this disconnect, because if anything, it's your grandparent, because your parents too busy, it's your grandparent that may have took you to the museum.
So let me,
because they had
I
the
really
time.
want to speak to that, because I think for me, this is a multi-layered problem or multi-layered issue. So I recall that my grandparents on both sides of my family were unique in that they owned land, and they owned a significant amount of land in rural PD, South Carolina. And I also recall had my earliest understanding of the fact that even that single historical fact was important enough that I wanted to uncover that. I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to discuss it. I wanted to understand their lives. And I remember so vividly, each time I attempted to navigate those conversations, my elders shut down. So I also want to speak to and recognize and call out that there's still, to some degree, a level of trauma that our elders have experienced. My grandmother would repeatedly say, I don't want to talk about those things, or those things are best left unsaid, or it would take a lot of work to finally get her to a place where she felt comfortable. So I just want to also acknowledge, like, there is a level of psychic collective trauma that our elders have endured. But this is also why it is important for us to start the reframing of why it is important for us to tell our stories. Our stories matter. Our stories are healing. Our stories are powerful. This is even connected to the beautiful movement that I'm seeing with Black women in particular, about why talk therapy has been critical to our self-healing journey, right? So then I think the other part of that, though, is that we have also collectively learned through the harm that institutions like libraries, archives, and museums have predicated against communities of color with good intentions. Let me say that, often with good intentions, so not like with malicious intent, but the harm that has been created when glam institutions recognize the value of our historical legacies, our material culture, and then come in under the guise of, well, tell us your stories or participate in this oral history project. And then there's this like violent level of extraction where which we share our narratives and then they are broken apart or framed in a way that is harmful. Or there's a fine line that we have to navigate between sharing something that should be shared with non-Black folks, and recognizing that like there's some things that we still do want to keep within community and within our oral agency, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, we did some interviews with a 105-year-old. Shelley would have been great to be here. Shelley Thompson. She does a program called Golden Designs, and she specifically speaks to those who are over 100.
oh wow, okay.
Yes, I've let out like a piece, but I'm like, we sitting on the rest of that. That goes to the Avery.
Mm-hmm.
What you don't see them out in public will be in the repositories of the Avery. Because we have to have these stories, but even not even of our centurions, that the grandmothers or those who have access to great grandmothers who really aren't that old anymore.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I just think that part of what in my work, what I have seen is part of that hesitation is feeling like the gatekeepers or those. So basically, it goes back to my issue of trust. I personally witnessed people bringing in boxes of material culture for people like Miss Wright and Mr. Pyatt and Mr. Franks to go through because they trusted them. They have that relationship. It's not the same thing when a white-run institution is asking for those things. You have this sense of lack of relationship, lack of trust, but then also like this material culture is so important. Do I hand it over, or how much do I hand over, or what role can I actually play in helping to like shape and craft this story? So again, I think this is another reason that it's so important for us to enter into the field.
Can you define for me again what material culture is?
I want to make a sort of broad definition. So a broad definition would be what we like to call like gray literature. It could be anything from pamphlets to church bulletins to unpublished manuscripts. It could be pictures. It could be baskets that your great-great-grandmother wove. It could be quilts that your auntie made. It could be things that your uncle whittled. It's basically anything that as a people we have created or made or contributed
And tend
to.
to overlook because
Yes.
it's just right there in the house. Gotcha. Okay. Whew. Y'all work is heavy.
Yeah, so the idea, and I like technology. I'm one of those older people that actually likes technology and respects it. But I want you to just give some of your thoughts about the idea of the virtual museum versus the community or the walk-in museum. What are the pros and cons, disadvantages, strengths, weaknesses, and how we should approach that, or
So what am I trying to say? I have so many thoughts about technology. I think in this moment of COVID-19, the first thing I want to say is that the internet, having access to Wi-Fi, is a utility. Everyone should have access to that at low to no cost. And that's an issue of equity and access. And we saw immediately at the beginning of this quarantine and the beginning of the pandemic how crucial it was for people to have basic access to the internet. Because of that, we saw a blooming of Zoom. I'm very familiar with Zoom. If you work in certain sectors, you're always sort of on a Zoom meeting. But we saw the ways in which Zoom, Google Hangout, Hop In, all of these virtual platforms that allow for people to build and create community, to be physically distant, but not socially and communally distant, which I think was also like really important. So I'll say all that to say, what I immediately then noticed and what it sort of immediately happened within the field of museums and libraries and archives is that we have always had sort of two streams, if you will, sort of two ways that we think about museums. Museums in terms of like museum education. So there's a kind of museum education, and then there's like a muse tech, so museum technology. So everything from social media to online exhibitions to what kind of programming can be streamed, that kind of thing. But what we also very quickly saw and what we understood was like the digital divide is a very real thing. And also, at what point does it become both dry and lackluster and not as compelling when you kind of just keep churning pictures of what's in your collections or what's in your archives. And so thinking creatively and powerfully about, okay, what does engagement actually look like online? I personally think that in an instance like COVID-19, you know, during a pandemic, it's absolutely fantastic that museums have come together to create these beautiful online exhibitions, making sure that like people still have an educational tool for children and families that are at home in the quarantine, and making sure that you have, you know, Facebook Live and IG streams of curators walking you through the galleries or curators talking to you about specific objects, and those things are good. There's still something though about the power of the physical space of a museum, that experiential dimension of being in a building or being in a space where you can guide yourself. So that self-guided learning where no one sort of telling you what to think or choosing the object for you. So I don't know for me if it's necessarily an issue of one is better than the other, but I am an advocate of creative, useful ways in which we can use technology, but I will never be in favor of losing the physical museum, because that experience of walking into a museum space, whether it's a science center, whether it's an art museum, whether it's a children's museum, all of those are very different, phenomenal, creative, dynamic experiences. And by experience, I'm very clearly talking about the tangible qualities, the experiential learning. I'm talking about the smells and the tastes, the way that your eyes are, you know, fall upon different objects. So I think that there's nothing that can surpass that. So while I think that it's always good to make those online digital sort of offerings, there's nothing that beats the experience of the physical museum. It's a very embodied experience. And for me, that whole thing about embodiment in a lot of ways goes back to like our earlier conversation about we are here in our physical bodies because of our ancestors. And so when we show up in a museum and we have a human, full, embodied experience, we're sharing that with our ancestors. We're sharing that, and then we're actually, so just on a whole other level, we're actually on a cellular level embodying and bearing that within our body and creating that in our DNA structure. So then when we have our own children, we're passing that on. We're passing on that knowledge and that delight and that tangible whatever, gets caught up in the neurons. We're passing that on. So for me, that's why that embodied experience of visiting a physical museum will never surpass what we can offer online. That technology just does not exist.
Yes, 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 yes.
Avery, when people would come to Avery, I remember telling them, well, it's sort of a specialty museum.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of broad. I mean, we had a lot of stuff, but it was a specialty museum to a degree. And I'd let them know, you're not going to learn the entire Black experience here, but you're going to get a lot. And people were able to, there was something refreshing. You were able to relax in that. Now, then we have the larger museums, like the one in Washington, D.C. That museum, I mean, I literally spent like 4 days in D.C.
Oh, yeah.
And went there every single day. And I still don't think I saw everything. And it was kind of tense. I mean, it was.
Yeah.
Do you think that museums can be a little too much, a little too overwhelming, trying to encompass too much in it, or
that is? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm finished. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is one of the primary arguments against the overuse of technology in museums, because when everything is about an app, or when everything is about a QR code, or everything is about virtual reality or AI, and it's like a sensorial overload, so much so that now you're focused on a screen, or you're focused on some level of interactivity that takes you outside, again, of this other kind of embodied experience. The argument is that technology it can literally be too much for your brain to process. It's too much for the sensorial overload. And I think that Namak in DC is a phenomenal, fantastic museum. But I also think that part of that is it was a 100-year journey to create this institution. And I think some of it was like, we need to bring in all of the stuff, right? Because we've been collecting things for so long, and we have so much to say, and this is our way to kind of like actively have a kind of reparations and to demonstrate the phenomenal contributions of Black people in America. I don't know if it's necessarily a technology issue, but I think it's definitely like that's not an institution that you can in any way absorb all of that content and material in one day. You're right. You need a good 4 or 5 days. But I am someone, especially when we talk about small children who I think are already way overexposed to screens, I think it is too much. Let me also say that the data and the research shows that when it comes to retention and memory, because this is something that is like my soapbox. When it comes to retention and memory, what you read on a screen does not create a neural pathway. It is not retained in the brain the same way that reading with your eye on a printed page does. So I apply that to the same kind of experience about museum going. On the one hand, you can sit at a lunch counter and you can, sit in that chair and you can kind of replicate to some degree that experience of, activists trying to integrate a lunch counter. And then you pull up a screen and you can plug in all of these things. And that is a fantastic way to learn. I'm not saying that it's not a fantastic way to learn, but and it's a good way to kind of get that muscle memory. but at the same time, looking at the actual object, looking at a piece of the actual lunch counter, or being able to read the actual testimony, I think might have a different sort of indelible experience. And so like I said, I don't know if it's necessarily fair to kind of like say that there's a hierarchy of experience or to say that one thing is better than the other. But I think this is so important for us to think about the ways in which we think about technology, the power of technology, what's our expectation of technology. I am not an advocate of technology for technology's sake, just to say we have iPads or just to say we have all these other things, because I think in a lot of ways that does distract and take away from a different kind of sensorial, even ephemeral, intellectual, educational experience. And so I don't know, that's my kind of soapbox. I'm always mindful of for me, again, it goes back to the educational process and the experiential process. How are you going to remember all of these things? What's the indelible experience about physically being in a museum? What are you going to remember most? One of my favorite museums in the world is the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. And I've been there now, I don't know how many times, but I remember one of the first times that I went, one of the sort of offerings that the museum had was that they had gotten folks to read the slave narratives. And so you walk into this room, the door is then closed. It's a dark, dark, dark room, and you're kind of like sitting around like on these sort of benches, and you're hearing the slave narratives be read, and then there's like a flash of purple, and a flash of green, and a flash of red. And it was this rich, sensorial, very kind of tactile, embodied experience. And it was a way for me to just be able to close my eyes and listen to the narratives. And I have never forgotten that experience, because it was then for me attached with color and emotion and all of this feeling. And I just remember leaving there thinking like, that is what a museum experience is. And it would not have been the same if I could have just ran my phone against a QR code and gotten like a name of someone, or necessarily read a panel. So like I said, I think it's the intent behind the technology. It's the way that the technology is designed that creates the experiential and indelible impact of that experience that then I think can truly articulate why and how technology is important within museums.
What are your hopes for the International African American Museum?
Oh man. My hopes are that Gullah Geechee people are framed and understood. First of all, that Gullah Geechee people are actual co-creators for any endeavor of this museum. That Gullah Geechee people are not relegated to museum relics. That Gullah Geechee people serve on the board. That Gullah Geechee people have active advisory committees, that they have co-creation power, that they have real voting power, that they have input and sway, because Gullah Geechee people are not dead. And they, that particular institution is going to be in what used to be part of thriving downtown Gullah Geechee communities that are now victims of violent gentrification in Charleston. And so what I would want to have happen is that there's a real conversation about who gets to be a vendor in that museum, who gets to have free membership in that museum, who gets to, who is asked to share their narratives and their material culture, what relationships are being built. And even though it is the International African American Museum, that museum, the positionality of that museum, everything that has to be at the heart and center of interpretation of that museum has to be about Gullah Geechee people. And it cannot be, it has to be more than like, oh, well, we consulted them at the end. It has to be a co-created process. So my hope for that institution is that there is more visibility for those communities, that there is more power for those communities, that there is economic opportunity for those communities, and that there is some mechanism put in place for sustaining the viability and health and mental well-being of those communities. Because I'm going to tell you, every time I come to Charleston, I weep. Charleston has become a hotbed of, I don't know, it's the violent gentrification, the erasure of Gullah Geechee culture. What I have seen, the treatment and the framing of the young Gullah children who sell the flowers, they have made them out to be almost like criminals, ticketing them for doing something that they have done for decades in their family. So I want that museum to address those things. I think that it should not be a tourist trap. That it should be a working, functional museum for the benefit of communities of color. And I think that it has so much opportunity to tell a different narrative in opposition to the narrative that has long been held as the master narrative in Charleston and in the region, that somehow Black people were just, our origin started with like the, institution of slavery, and that plantations exist because plantation owners were these right Christian, moral, upstanding folks who just happened to fall into the institution of slavery, involving enslaving people. I don't know, but that the way that the tourism is set up, it's all about plantation weddings and learning about furniture and learning about the lives of white plantation owners, and not centering the lives of the enslaved. So my hope for that institution, again though, is that it centers the living lives of Gullah Geechee people, and that it plays an active role in local politics, that it does not try and remain neutral, because we know that that is a fallacy. Museum neutrality is a fallacy. And I hope that the interpretation is one that is bold, that is factual, and that, again, empowers communities of color, particularly in Charleston, and any visitors of color, challenges them in ways that allows them to see themselves as liberated descendants of ancestors who are amazing, phenomenal people.
We walking down the street now. We're on Chalmers. I've heard some people say, "Oh well, they're going to get the International African American Museum, so they don't need the old slave mart."
Wow. Okay.
And you just sort of look at them like, do you realize every step you make in this space and place, it's with the aid of an ancestor? Not that everyone qualifies to be, but blood spilled, bodies buried, the whole nine. And I've seen you over the years back and forth in and through Charleston, and all with there's there's these discussions that you evoke that allow regular people to know that they can be involved in the process of how the stories are told, what they have access to, and how they have access to information in space and place. I remember a gentleman on Twitter, was it just yesterday, saying, well, why didn't they put Denmark on a well-traveled path in the park so everybody could see him? I said, because you have to mean to go to him. I said they fought good, hard, well for 22 years to get to where he is. His back is there for a reason. And they just weren't getting it. That you can go to Denmark VC's monument and reflect.
And of course, the old slave mart is a specialty museum. So that's what we talk about, you know, that the importance of the community or the specialty museum.
But I mean, for me, that's the conundrum of Charleston. Yeah, I was literally just having this conversation. I feel like I'm always having this conversation with my friends and all of us who went to school in college at the College of Charleston in the late '90s, right? And anyone who went to the College of Charleston before that, or even anyone who was born and raised in Charleston. Charleston has, at this moment, I feel like an identity problem. It has an identity crisis. I remember very vividly that Charleston was intentionally marketed as a place where you could go and see and support Gullah Geechee cultural heritage. Everything was sweetgrass this and sweetgrass that, and it was an image and picture of a Black woman or a Black man weaving a basket. Charleston made millions off of that. It made millions off of a specialty kind of tourism where you could kind of step back in time. You could step back in time and wander around these plantations and feel as if you were connected to a white plantation owner, and you can understand what capitalism at the backs of enslaved people actually meant, but they weren't going to frame it in that way, right? And then there was this shift where all of a sudden Charleston became a foodie city, a foodie town, and it became all about food culture and what famous chef and what famous restaurant, and you started to see more people show up and greater gentrification, more alarm about the gentrification, and then a tamping down about why gentrification was a good thing because it benefited the economy. But then you started to see more Gullah Geechee folks be removed from the kitchens. Those same ancestors who contributed to who created those recipes, you know, that tourists were hungry to devour. And you started to see now, for the first time in history, there's hardly any Gullah Geechee people on the peninsula. And so anyway, I feel like it has a marketing problem. It has an identity crisis, a problem, because I think it no longer values culture. It no longer values the cultural contributions of the Gullah Geechee folks and any of those ancestors who were enslaved. It's now about what hotel, what fancy restaurant, what carriage ride you can take to get some like watered down version of history. And it's really sad to see, because one of the things that I remember vividly going to Charleston since I was a small child, because I had an ancestor who lived there who was 100+ years old. I remember going to Charleston since I was around 5, was the sound of Charleston. You could hear Gullah being spoken loudly everywhere. It felt like you were in like the Caribbean.
When I first got here, I had
a lyrical quality. And now when you go, you hear, I don't know what you hear. You hear the tourists asking where's the Starbucks. And so for me, I just think it has a crisis, because it doesn't value cultural contributions of our ancestors and of the living Gullah Geechee communities.
Facts.
Yeah, I have one. me personally, I have one final question. This might be slightly outside of your immediate realm, but I think you, being a museum professional, can be really important in this conversation and work going forward. When you travel the Black world, the African diaspora, you'll notice that there's a lack of libraries, repositories, and museums. That would be in the Caribbean and of course in Africa as well. And they really need that there. They need it. They need those stories. They need them upheld and told, and oral history programs and things like that. What advice or what can you offer, or what do you have to say about that going forward?
Well, first of all, let me just say that when this pandemic is over, the first thing that I hope to do is hop on whatever plane is going to Senegal to see the new, the largest museum of African civilization in Senegal.
Yes.
So countries in East Africa, I guess I'll pull back a little bit and say, there is an entire movement of librarians and archivists working within different parts of Africa right now who are actively working on building library and information studies programs, building archival repositories. Where I work here at the University of Florida, we have phenomenal archivists and librarians and scholars who are helping to build an entire Caribbean repository, digital repository of documents. It's fantastic. So I will just say that there is an entire movement. It might not necessarily be as visible, but there's an entire movement to bring information architecture to the continent in ways that will not only unite the continent digitally, but also create this whole new wave of African librarianship. I mean, there's a whole caucuses of Black librarians right now who are working, or African librarians right now who are working to have Africa be this a wired, connected Africa through libraries, archives, and museums, and it's absolutely fantastic. And like I said, there are phenomenal scholars who are working right now in the Caribbean, throughout the Caribbean, who are doing this work. People, like Dr. Ramona LaRoche, people here at my university, Lori Taylor, just so many people who are working on these projects, and it's absolutely fantastic. I believe, I'm trying to think of the time of year, but every year in Johannesburg, there's like this huge groundbreaking Africa Tech Conference. Africa is doing so much innovation right now in terms of technology and librarianship that you already see people like Bill Gates is already there trying to get in on the groundwork. You already see Netflix is already like, hey, Africa is where it's at in terms of content and digital media. We're going to invest all of our money and time and resources right now into exploding Netflix Africa. You see Mark Zuckerberg and all these other folks, because of all these like brilliant Africans who are using art and digital technologies and librarianship and archival work, this phenomenal synergy, artists, lots of amazing artists who are basically creating a whole new continent. And so it's phenomenal to see. Early on in my doctoral journey, I had the opportunity to kind of work on a project of helping to build a library information school in eastern part of Uganda. The other thing is some of these projects are troubled because of on the ground conflict, and that was one of the projects. But I know for a fact that people are actively working on building library and information studies programs, and also just building collectives, all kinds of museums. Like I said, the first time that I get an opportunity, I'm going to Senegal because I want to see that museum.
Thank you so much, Dr. Porchia Moore. This has been great. And we truly appreciate you and the work that you do.
Thank you so much. I appreciate both of you all, and I appreciate you all for allowing me to be able to talk about the thing that I love, and for creating this space. I love that the hashtag virtual Sankofa, I think it's brilliant. So again, I want to thank you all for the work that you all do, because it's so, so very important.
Give thanks. See you on June 13th, June 14th.
Yes. Yes. You know what I wanted to share? I don't know if Ms. Wright remembers this, but like I believe, I don't know if I was an undergraduate or like a new graduate student, but one year Ms. Wright asked me to give the opening prayer at one of the early Remembrance Day ceremonies, and I gave the opening prayer, and I've never forgotten that, because it was such a phenomenal, amazing experience, and it's been beautiful to see Remembrance Day grow.
Right.
All of these different iterations, and I think it's become. I know personally. I try to go as many years as I can, but I personally know people who come from the upstate, who come from out of state, people who come from other countries to come and participate, and it's been absolutely fantastic to see that core group of dedicated people who keep this Charleston Remembrance Day alive. And
Hey, Deborah!
Yes, it's been phenomenal. And like I said, the activity and the offerings, the imagery, the video, everything on the Facebook page is phenomenal, because those of us who can't come for whatever reason, we feel like we're there because there is such a sense of community that we can see. My children now have gone multiple years in a row.
Yep. We watch them grow.
Yeah, and everybody can kind of see in pictures how they've grown.
And we thank Brenda for the social media presence, because when she came on board in 2012, I believe it was, that changed the whole scope of it in terms of social media and the videography and her being a documentarian and kind of doing that. So yeah.
We just roll with
and we have watched your children grow. I
love to the babies.
All right, thank you.
I really wanted them to crash your stuff, because
they're in class.
Oh, school ain't over yet?
Tomorrow is the last day.
Okay.
Well, you're doing a beautiful job. I love your foodways pieces. I love the children and the way they're growing, and your menus look scrumptious. I wish I were so I could crash in for dinner sometimes, but
Thank you so much.
But anyway, yeah, thank you again.
Oh, wait a second. I may never get this chance again. How did you get to Japan?
Oh yeah, I remember you went to Japan. Yeah.
Yes.
You were still at Charleston when you went to Japan, right?
Yes, I was in graduate school.
Yeah.
I believe I was in my last year or last semester. I do not recall how I found out about this opportunity, but I found out about an opportunity to teach. Well, so it's a program called the JET program, which stands for Japan Exchange and Teaching. Half of your responsibility was to act and serve as a cultural ambassador. The other half was to serve as an ESL teacher. The part that excited me was serving as a cultural ambassador, because like I said, at the time I was working at the Avery Research Center. So it was my goal and intention to kind of take what I had learned at the Avery and use it to teach young Japanese students about African American culture, and then also about American culture. And I submitted my application. I was selected. It's a very selective process. I was invited to interview in Atlanta at the Japanese consulate. I was selected, packed all my belongings up, flew out of Atlanta with a large group of folks and spent about 2.5 years in Japan teaching English in Saitama Prefecture. I lived in a town called Konosu, and I worked in an actual village, a rice growing village. So I would have to ride my bike about 40 minutes or longer from the town to the village. The village, literally, it was just rice paddies everywhere. And the town where I lived was on the Takahashi train line, which took you directly into Tokyo. It was about maybe 40-minute train ride into Tokyo. So I literally had like the best of both worlds because I could go to Tokyo literally every day and hang out if I wanted to. I lived like in a town. I had a host family when I first arrived because they had purchased me an apartment in a brand new apartment building, and the building was still under construction. So I was blessed to be able to be placed with a Japanese family that's still my family to this day. I still communicate with them. We love each other very much. And got to basically spend my days in a village teaching elementary students, middle school students, and then I was asked by the village sort of mayor to teach English classes, I think once or twice a month in the evenings, and that was also amazing. So I literally taught, depending on the day and the time or whatever, I taught everyone from kindergarten. My oldest student, I think at the time, was 88. He was in his 80s, and it was absolutely fantastic.
I've been dying to hear that story for the longest.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And so
Because
I would say again, that's the other. I mean, I am a culturist. So
yes,
when it was so exciting for me to be able to not necessarily be living in Tokyo like some of my other friends, to be able to have the village experience. Because with my village experience, I was able to, my very first year in Japan, I belonged to a Japanese folk singing group. So I learned Japanese folk songs. I traveled with them. I learned how to play the shamisen, which is a Japanese, very ancient traditional Japanese instrument. I learned, everyone knows I kind of love ikebana, so I learned ikebana, which is a very ancient traditional Japanese flower sculpture art. And where I worked in the town, where I worked in that little small town of called Kawasato, the next town over was an even smaller town, and they didn't grow rice as much as they grew flowers. So we would take the bus, we called it the flower bus. We would take the flower bus from that one town to go to the other town to take the flower making ikebana classes. So I also took Taiko drum class. That was, all my teachers were like in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. I could not keep up with them. They would drop to the floor and pop back up and bam the drum, and I would be out of breath. So that was for me the best part about being in Japan, is because I didn't have Japanese language skills, but any Japanese that I learned, I truly learned through immersion because I belonged to a folk singing group. I tried my hand at taiko drum. That didn't last that long. But I also did ikebana. I hiked with a Japanese hiking club, which is why I loved hiking so much. We climbed mountains all over Japan. Everybody in that group was also in their like 60s, 70s, 80s. They would be smoking a cigarette, going up the mountain, and bypassing me and being like, "Are you okay?" in Japanese, and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm all right. I'm good." But so yeah, I wanted to understand that cultural frequency. That vibration was so beautiful to me. I wanted to understand all the ancient ways. I learned how to make. I did indigo isome, I think is what it's called. Indigo dye dying in Japan. I took all of the cultural classes that you could take. So we learned all of these ancient arts like indigo dyeing. I learned how to make, I forgot the word for it, but I learned how to make sandals out of dried rice material. I did any and everything that I could to immerse myself in traditional Japanese arts and culture, and that was the most beautiful time of my life, and that was amazing.
Muscle. Yes, 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 yes. I guess I worked for Mitsubishi for a while in Philadelphia and New York, and it, that Shibumi thing. I've always wanted to go. You just fulfill that part of all that video. That's mine. That's right there. I've been dying to hear the story.
Oh, you would love it. You would love it. We were gonna go this summer, but I forgot about. I was trying to coordinate with my family, my Japanese family. I forgot about the fact that the Olympics was supposed to be happening.
Yes, yes.
So we were like, okay, maybe we'll try another date, and then COVID-19 happened, and so we wouldn't have been able to go anyway. But be on the lookout soon. All of us will be in Japan.
Dr. Porchia Moore, I love you.
So much.
Thank you. Deborah, you still had it?
Yes, no, I'm here. Yes, so thank you, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
All right. Thank y'all so much.
And thank you for the work you do.
Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to share it.
Peace.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.